the Evergreen Freedom Foundation, because freedom matters.
Good afternoon, and a special welcome to friends and colleagues of the Evergreen Freedom Foundation. Perhaps some of you are guests today, and if so, welcome. We're glad to have you. My thanks to Booker Stallworth, our communications director, who's your host today. Very few events would keep me from being with you personally today, especially since you're about to hear from one of my favorite speakers, the Honorable Maurice McTigue. But EFF's trustees and some of our senior staff are in Spokane today. We're doing our annual board retreat, reviewing the results of our past work and looking keenly at what's ahead in the next year and beyond. But Mr. McTigue is working very hard while he's here in Washington State. After he has lunch with you, he's going to fly over to Spokane to be with us at a dinner tonight. Let me tell you why I value Mr. McTigue so much. He understands leadership and why it's necessary to achieve results that really matter. In fact, he's the person I really got the idea for the performance-based budgeting for him, the priority of government model. He understands the difficult trade-offs that must be made in the world of public policy. He has specialized in analyzing obstacles and determining ways to successfully get through or around them. He knows how to deregulate government agencies. He knows how to evaluate success and how to use failure as a tool for growth. I could go on, but suffice to say that Maurice energizes, equips, and focuses those of us who work in the public policy arena, whether we're an elected official or whether we're one of the sovereigns in this country, otherwise known as citizens. You have Mr. McTiigue's bio in front of you. So I'll just summarize some of his vast accomplishments. He's been a member of Parliament in New Zealand, an ambassador, and a cabinet minister. It was in his role as cabinet minister that he really first came to my attention. New Zealand was sliding into an economic black hole, and it became Mr. McTiigue's job to help fix the problem. What he and a handful of others did is now known as the New Zealand Miracle, and he has taught all of us what's really possible if we combine great vision with a plan. Please help me welcome today the Honorable Maurice McTigue.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction, and I very much appreciate it. I spent most of my life as a farmer, and as a farmer I think I developed a set of values that enabled me to know the difference between right and wrong, and to try and apply that over time. But I want to start off by passing my compliments on to the Evergreen Freedom Foundation. And as I listened to your chairman and as I watched the video presentation, it reminded me of, on many occasions, taking visitors to the war memorials in Washington, D.C. And there's one caption on the Korean War Memorial that always reminds me of something that we take for granted. And the caption just says simply, "The one thing that we know about freedom is that it is not free." And I think that that's something that we need to remind ourselves of from time to time. I also see much of the work that the Freedom Foundation does from time to time, and I appreciate the quality of that work just the same as those who spoke about the Freedom Foundation mentioned in their presentations. What I'm trying to do here is make my computer work so that I can see what I'm trying to read. The presentation that I'm about to give to you I will make available to the Evergreen Freedom Foundation, and you can have it sent to you electronically, or they can send it to you in hard copy, because I'm going to speak to that presentation rather than try and go through the whole of the presentation. One of the things that I became interested in government was just the issue of accountability. And it's interesting that it's only the English language that really has a word for that concept of accountability. But if we go to the dictionary, we'll find that what it says about accountability is that it's taking responsibility, or the longer definition is taking responsibility for one's actions. But that wasn't quite enough for the work that we were going to be doing, so we needed to expand that definition. And our expanded definition says that the process of accountability requires that we disclose fully and truthfully our performance to those who are entitled to know. And that's pretty significant when you think about it, because it creates a huge number of incentives. It's not a matter of choice. It's requires to disclose. So you can't just decide whether you want to do it or not. It also says fully and truthfully. So partial disclosure isn't good enough. And in many instances we find around governments that what we get is partial disclosure. It wasn't until I came to the United States that I heard a couple of things that really caused me great concern. The first one was, that's good enough for government work. And that isn't good enough for government work. And the other was, those are things we don't really want to know. And as soon as you hear either of those comments, what you do know is that you need to know. So fully and truthfully is important. Performance, of course, really refers to what did we achieve. And that doesn't mean carrying out the actions that you said you were going to carry out. It means actually producing the results that you predicted you would produce. And to those who are entitled to know just means that if you're an elected representative, you have a duty. And that duty is only fully completed if you do make known to your constituencies those things that they are entitled to and should know about what's happening inside their government. So this process of disclosure is at the heart of a lot of the work that we do at George Mason University on the area of accountability. Because when you think about it, bad things can't happen in the light of day. If we want to do things that we're not too happy about, we want to have some kind of secrecy or shelter from them. The more open we make those, the less we have to do to try and govern people's behavior, because that process of disclosure itself will be the governing mechanism. Rules and regulations don't work very well in the ethical field. We should actually know what is right and wrong and just do it. As soon as you make a rule, everybody thinks that they can work right up to the edge of the rule and maybe a little bit further. They're not obligated to use that internal self-controlling mechanism, which is your own set of values, that says, I know that's right or wrong. One of the interesting cases at the moment for me is Enron. And by the time that case is completed, setting up the special trusts, which was at the heart of some of the Enron problems, was probably quite legal. There were no offences in setting them up. The purpose for which the special trust was set up was where the problem lay. The purpose was to disguise the level of indebtedness of the organization. That was wrong, and everybody involved with it should have known straight away that it was wrong, regardless of whether the law said you could set them up. So you can't get away, in my view, from taking responsibility for your actions just because the law allows you to do something. Your personal principles should take you to a higher standard than the mere rules that are set down in the law. I saw a lovely quotation the other day from Ronald Reagan, and just because I was talking about laws and it came to mind, and the quotation was, I often wonder what would have happened if Moses had run the 10 Commandments through the Congress before they were released. Results is the second part of that equation that we're talking about. And In government, we often get debate about what a result is. And we've debated that on many occasions, and based upon my own personal experience and the experience of our government, the work that we've done in recent years, in government, results should be defined as what public benefit arose from this action. And that is measurable and quantifiable. It's not how many actions you carried out, it's what happened as a result. Can I give you an example? The Office of Management and Budget about a year ago asked us if we would meet with them and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the reason for that meeting was to talk to each of those groups about the measures that the Securities and Exchange Commission was using. And when we sat down for that meeting, what they said was, and they ran through their measures, we measure the number of prosecutions we take, we measure how quickly we can take them, we measure how successful we are, we measure how many of them are settled before they go to court, and how many go to court, and we think we do a good job. And they said to me, so what do you think? And I said, well, those measures tell me whether or not you're good prosecutors. I said, when I go back and look at why you were created in 1929, I actually find that the reason for your creation was to bring discipline to and confidence to the marketplace. So tell me, is the behavior in the marketplace this year better than it was last year, better than it was 5 years ago, or better than it was 10 years ago? And they said, we don't know. And I said to them, you're not entitled not to know. They said, it's hard to find out. I said, I don't care about hard, find out. If I was the president, the only thing I would want to know was, is the behavior in the marketplace better or worse? If it's worse, we'd know that you're doing the wrong things. If it was better, we could feel confident and go and do something else. But just measuring your prosecutions tells us how many actions you take, but it doesn't tell us whether or not you're on top of the best and the worst of the practices in the marketplace. That's what results are. It tells you whether or not you're getting the benefits that you sought from this particular process. So now I want to move and talk to you a little bit about some of the examples of applying that kind of philosophy to government itself. And I'm going to talk about some of my experiences from being in government in my own country in New Zealand. I'm going to start with some anecdotes and then move to something that's a little bit more substantial. And while these are not the most important examples, they demonstrate thinking about things a little bit differently. New Zealand was settled by Europeans about 170 years ago. The majority of the settlers came from Britain, and those settlers really wanted to replicate the lifestyle that they had enjoyed in Britain, even though they came from the middle classes in the main. But they wanted to be able to have estates, and they wanted to be able to hunt, and they wanted to do all of those sort of things. But New Zealand had no large animals. So they brought deer with them. And they put the deer out in parks, and gradually they multiplied and they escaped out into the forests. And from that point onwards, they grew in numbers and they became a problem to our flora and fauna and the forests. About 1880, the government decided that it needed to do something about this and decided on a policy of total eradication. So for the next 90 years, we paid lots and lots for the Forest Service and others to go out there and hunt down these deer and slaughter them. And they never managed to get the numbers down very much. But of course, because they were now a prohibited animal, you weren't allowed to sell their meat, you weren't allowed to sell their antlers, you weren't allowed to sell their skins. All of that was prohibited. In the late 1970s, we just made a change of policy and said, clearly this doesn't work. Why don't we just let farmers farm them? And you know, the farmers went out and they caught all of those darn deer. And they stuck them behind 8-foot-high fences. And why would they do that? You know, within about a period of about 9 months, a Wapiti hind went from zero value to about $7,000. And on a good day, you could catch 15 to 20 of them. And they depleted the stock of those deer across all of that country that was being damaged. Today, New Zealand is the largest producer of venison in the world. Since that day 30 years ago, we have not spent $1 on deer eradication. We now have it as about our 5th or 6th major export. Now, by comparison, the control policy in the United States seems to be that you'll run them over with your cars with varying levels of success. It doesn't seem to be the right kind of approach. Here's another example. When I was in Cabinet, on one occasion, the Department of Transportation came to us and they wanted to increase the fees for driver licensing. And we said to them, naturally, why? And they said, well, government policy is that we have to fully recover the cost of these services now, and we're not. So we need to increase the fees. So we said to them, why do we actually do it? And they clearly thought that was a stupid question. Said, well, sir, everybody has to have a driver's license. And this is to test their competency as a driver. Okay, but why do we have the relicensing process? Because it seems that nothing in that process actually tests their competency as a driver. So that was a harder question, and they thought about it for a while and said, we've always done it that way. That is not a good response. Remember that, Toby, that's not a good response. And so we said to them, go away, think about it, come back in 10 days and tell us why we do it. They came back in 10 days and had to say, we can't find a very good reason for doing it. So we gave people lifetime driver's licenses, which they didn't need to renew until after the age of 74, from which point they had to have an annual medical to show that they were still physically fit to be able to drive. Consequently, after 9/11, we have to renew the photo on the license every 10 years now. So we didn't need an increase in fees. In fact, there was a whole agency we didn't need any longer. So we eliminated it. For 90 years, nobody had asked that question, why do we do this? I actually got somebody to do some research into how we got started. Anybody in the room like to guess how we got started with a process requiring you to renew your driver's license? Any guesses? Pardon? Increased taxes never ever worked as far as I'm aware. But, you know, that's quoted as a reason. Larger bureaucracy gave people some jobs. It probably did that. When we went back and researched it, you know, the reason was back in 1906, licenses were issued on paper, and they lasted about 5 years. And they just wore out, so you needed a new one. And that started a process that lasted for 90 years, and nobody asked the question, why? And insisted on an answer. Just thought there was a benefit because we did it, and there really wasn't a benefit. Now, you do it because you want identity cards, and you're not prepared to say you want identity cards. But asking those kind of questions, in our experience, was very telling. So what we were doing there was starting to look closely at how organizations performed and whether or not they were producing the benefit. One of the organizations that I was responsible for was New Zealand Post. And like the post office here, they were moderately efficient if you are very kind. They had lost money for 33 years. They managed to get the mail delivered in anywhere from sort of 2 to 4 days. It continually went up in price, and it was extraordinarily bureaucratic. So we said to New Zealand Post, what's the result we want? And identified that result as all of the mail is to be delivered everywhere in the country inside 24 hours. That's not unreasonable, because FedEx can do it. So why not New Zealand Post? So that was the goal, and we required them to do that. No longer were they allowed to run losses, and what's more, they had to pay taxes on their profit, and they had to pay dividends to their shareholder, the government. For the last 18 years, they have done exactly that. All mail in every major city in New Zealand is now delivered within 12 hours. Everywhere else in the country, inside 24 hours. And all it required was saying to them, this is the bottom line. Ever been to the post office and had to wait in a queue? Ever been to the post office and not had to wait in a queue? That was one of their problems, and we were talking about that, their customer service quality, and said, you've got to solve it. So they hunted around for a while as to how you would solve it. Never guess how they solved it. They decided that they would pay $5 to every person that had to wait 5 minutes. And everybody said, you're crazy. It's going to cost thousands. It hardly cost a thing, because it never happened. Because every postmaster knew that head office in Wellington would know every day how many payments out of that imprest account occurred in their post office. And I've seen postmasters out there at the counter serving people to make certain there's not a queue. Now, isn't that interesting? That when you set the right kind of incentives in place, you can get the results that you want. Okay, let's take this a stage further now. What I'm talking to you about is the basis of some original thinking that went into the reforms. And I'm not going to go through in great detail, but I'm just going to give you some examples. When you apply that to a government organization and you start to ask those questions, function by function, is this something that we should really do? Is this something that the taxpayer should pay for? Or is this something that should be paid for by the users or consumers? Or maybe it's just something we shouldn't do at all. The result of applying that to the Department of Transportation was, function by function, an organization that had 5,600 people working for it finished up with 53 people working for it. The Forest Service that had 17,000 people working for it, going through a function by function and saying this is just a benefit to those who harvest the forest and we shouldn't be paying for it, they went from 17,000 to 17 people. And for the Ministry of Works that one time I was minister of, it went from, and that was just a construction company. It did all of the roads, the bridges, the schools, government buildings, everything like that, all of the civil engineering. It went from 28,000 people to 1. Now, interestingly, no public benefits were lost. We actually finished up with more employment because the money that we used to spend on public works now bought 40% more in services than it did previously. So there were more people employed in that work. They just weren't paid by the government or they weren't working as government employees. And that original thinking allowed us to bring the size, if you measure, of government, if you measure it in terms of employees, bring the size down by 66%. If you use a more important measure, though, it took government share of GDP, and that's counting local, state or regional and federal, from 44% where it was at the beginning of the reforms to around 27% of GDP, and enabled the economy to start growing again, enabled us to move from running deficits to running surpluses, enabled us to repay virtually all of our debt so that New Zealand is virtually debt-free today. So that's a process that allows you to start looking at everything and making critical judgments and say, do we really need to do this? Interestingly, governments continued to get re-elected while they were doing these things. It was not a terminal career option for people. In fact, quite the reverse. It seemed to be that governments lost power when they when they lost the incentive to make change. So, what about developing policy with a results focus? Well, here are some techniques that might actually be helpful. When people came from the agencies to us and said, here's a problem, these are the 5 questions that we would put to them. Number 1, where is the evidence that the problem exists? A lot of it's up here, but hard when you try to get it on the table. So the problem is more perceived than real. The second question, who is already doing something about this problem so that we don't need to? The third question, where is the evidence that this proposal or program will fix the problem? The fourth question, how much will it cost, and is this the best use of that money? And the fifth, and in my view the most important question, when will the problem be eliminated? Because many of the solutions are about dealing with the consequences of problems, not the causes. And you should be looking for solutions that eliminate the problem over time. Giving food stamps to hungry people might be a kind and good thing to do for a while, but ultimately it will be a bad thing to do, because what you do is build in intergenerational dependency, and that's not an acceptable lifestyle for anybody. Looking at what caused the hunger in the first instance might tell you that more than food stamps, these people need to be able to learn how to read or write. They need to learn how to be able to speak the language. They need to learn some computer skills. Or maybe they just need to learn to get up in the morning and go to work. Or all of the above. But what you're doing then is addressing the causes of problems, and once you ask that question, when will it be eliminated, you force the policymakers to start looking at, will this particular proposal ever eliminate the problem? Talking about the funding process, or what I would call the purchasing process. How does the government actually buy goods and services from people to produce results? Well, of course, every government around the world uses an appropriation process because it's required by the Constitution to do that. That's getting the authority of the legislature to spend money on a particular issue. But an appropriation is more like a grant of money to spend on something. It's actually a little bit like giving your children pocket money and hoping that they're going to invest it in the stock exchange, but know that that's never ever going to happen. What we did with appropriations that I think was really important was this, that after every appropriation was passed, it was converted into a purchase agreement. And a purchase agreement was very specific in that it identified exactly what it was that you expected to get for that money, and what quantity and quality and over what period of time. So if I was to go into that in a little bit more detail and show you what a purchase contract or a purchase agreement might look like, here's one that looks a little bit like the purchase agreement that I had with my chief executive officer, sort of a deputy secretary or whatever the equivalent is in your government, of the chief operating officer for the department. Incidentally, we made these professional people. They weren't appointees. They were chosen through a selection process that advertised the positions worldwide, and anybody could apply, and then we would find the very best person, and they got a term contract that could only be terminated for non-performance. If I didn't like my chief executive, there's nothing I could do about it. I had to live with him, and he had to live with me. All I could do was terminate his contract if he couldn't perform in producing the results that we wanted. So, focus upon competency. And then what the agreement would look like with the chief executive would be this. You will place into work 120,000 people for $60 million. 60,000 of those people will be long-term unemployed. 30,000 will be Maori, that's our native people. 15,000 will be people with disabilities. 5,000 will be people with significant social problems. The employment strategy will be built around the focus on localities of highest need. All communities must have access to the employment service. Finish. At the end of that year, you can look very precisely. Did you put 120,000 people into work or 130,000? How many of them were long-term unemployed and how many of them weren't? How many of them were Maori? How many of them were people with disabilities? Now you had something that gave you a real measure of whether or not you were succeeding in producing the outcome that you wanted, which was not solving unemployment, but improving the employability of people who are currently unemployed. They're two very different things. Employment strategies like that cannot solve unemployment. That's a factor of macroeconomic policy. But you can do something to improve the employability of people whose skills are not currently in demand in the labor market. There's two countries that have been going through this process for a period of time that I just want to mention, and that's Ireland and New Zealand. And the reason I mention them is because both of them are very similar. They started from a position of being extremely socialistic through the 50s, 60s, and 70s and found that those policies didn't work. Ireland had gone for about 30 years and never balanced its budget. New Zealand had gone for 23 years and never balanced its budget. Ireland's unemployment rate got as high as 23% at one stage. New Zealand's got to just on 12. Happened to be while I was minister. Not proud of that fact. But we got it down lower later on. Okay. The Irish are now considered to be the darling of Europe. And that's because they changed their attitudes to what was important to the Irish economy. And the driving force behind that change was what will make it attractive for people to invest in Ireland. And one of the first things that they identified was that their tax rates were too high, and they had to get them down. That their economy was too regulated, and they had to make it easier for investment to happen. That they had all sorts of rules that made it more expensive to employ people in Ireland than in other places, and they had to deal with those. And that's very much the same as happened in New Zealand. So today, Ireland's unemployment rate is under 4%. It's the fastest growing place in Europe. When I was there last, it was advertising. Ireland's got a population of about 2.5 million people. It was advertising all across Europe for people to come to work in Ireland. And at that time, it was advertising for 280,000 people to come from Eastern Europe to Ireland. Over the last 10 years, they've increased their population by 10% by bringing migrants in to fill the vacancies in the workforce. So one of the lessons out of that is that competitiveness is going to be a major issue for economies in the future. Your competitiveness is not with Oregon next door or Canada the other side of the border. Your competitiveness is now with every nation on earth. And you have to be aware of that. If they're doing things that make it more attractive for investment and jobs to occur in their economies, you've got to be able to do something to compete and balance that. It is not beyond your ability to do that. There are pockets of hugely successful economic activity in the United States, and there are pockets of very low economic activity in the United States. And in most cases, you can trace the causal factors back and see why it is that parts of Ohio are suffering so badly. It is impossible to try and save jobs that are obsolete in your economy. There is not a great demand for lamplighters today. And it doesn't matter how hard your government tried to preserve the positions of lamplighters, they would have failed. So looking forward at where the new opportunities might be and investing in the education, skill, and talents that are going to give you those jobs is crucial. That's one of the things that Ireland had going for it, and it's one of the things that we had going for us as well. That generally over time our education systems had been pretty good, and we were able to capitalize on those gains. Okay, in the case of New Zealand, the economy was turned around, as I mentioned before. It went from running deficits to surpluses. It's in its 13th year of surpluses now. Ireland's in its 9th year of surpluses. One of the good things is that both of them have been smart enough not to spend the surplus. And that applies to either governments of the right or the left. New Zealand has a very left-wing government at the moment, and it's not spending the surplus. The problem in the political process is that if there's money on the table, it will get spent. So you need to have a strategy before the surplus appears to take the money off the table. And our strategy was long before surpluses appeared to commit those surpluses to the retirement of debt and to a return to taxpayers and reduced rates of tax. And we did both of those things. The only new spending that we would allow would be the spending that resulted from a decreased cost of debt servicing because there was less debt. So you weren't actually growing the size of government spending. Interestingly, if you go through the processes that I've just mentioned, in most instances you can deliver significantly increased public benefit for the same or less money. And that field that I talked about before of employment programs, we were able to put 3 times as many people into work for 40% less money, because we concentrated on the programs that were good at putting people into work, not trying to preserve all of the programs and hope that one day they might work. Got to think about programs not as institutions, but as tools that we use to produce a result. And if it's not producing a result, then get rid of it. So, how can I conclude? My conclusion really is from an old Irish proverb, and that is, if you don't know where you're going, then any road will take you there. And in government, knowing exactly what it is that you're trying to achieve, I think is the first essential for improvement. And then built upon that, being able to see whether or not those who you bought goods and services were able to produce the results that you expected of them at the end of the year. It's not rocket science, it's pretty sensible stuff. And in many instances what we were doing was not introducing new ideas, but going back to old ideas that the past had told us worked well, but for some reason or other we'd abandoned them. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's been my pleasure, and I'd be happy to take some questions.